Chapter 4: Anti-Cultism Crimes Against Humanity.
The path where citizens' freedoms are trampled upon amidst their own approving cheers leads only to one end. It seems that you have started to forget about this, and those who do not remember their past are doomed to relive it. Therefore, I will remind you of the final destination of this path. Humanity now treads, and the depth of the abyss into which anti-cultists and the hidden shadow force behind them are pushing it. One person once said, with frightening prescience, that where they burn books, they will ultimately burn people as well. And shortly thereafter, all of humanity witnessed firsthand the embodiment of this prediction. Or rather, just logical reasoning in the horrors brought by Nazism. The citizens of Germany barely had time to react before the Nazi Party transformed from a fringe group into the country's leading political force, bringing with it terror, war, and genocide. Today, Nazism is remembered as the embodiment of extreme hatred, intolerance, discrimination, and totalitarianism, everything that is inhumane and anti-human. So now you know that Nazism in its most atrocious form was instigated by the anti-cultists of that time. All those methods used by the Nazis were typical of the anti-cultists from the most ancient times, and they rely on them even now. During the rise of Nazism, the anti-cultists instilled in Hitler and his henchmen the belief that only through fear could they conquer the world and win people's love, that it was the fastest and most effective way to gain total power, and so it happened. One of the main methods the Nazis resorted to at that time was genocide of individual dissenting groups and of entire nations. And if you closely examine the history of humanity, it becomes clear that genocide has always been a tool to strengthen the power of those who stand at the root of the modern form of anti-cultism. Now, let's recall where it all started during the Nazi era and draw a parallel to how the anti-cultists operate now. Nazis, at the instigation of their anti-cultist advisors, acted in a planned and systematic manner, preparing public opinion through propaganda, or rather through the manipulation of mass consciousness, convincing the German population to the necessity of war and genocide. Now, I will provide clear examples of what the present-day anti-cult movement already represents at its core, and what it could degenerate into if it remains unexposed.
Genocide.
The sequence of actions and the destructive focus of anti-cult organizations clearly indicate that they ultimately lead to the same outcomes as those brought about by Nazism. Right now, in front of the global community, the international terrorist network of anti-cultists is preparing the world for a new genocide. As a result of their actions, millions of people have already been labeled as members of cults, putting them in the position of potential victims. Those of you who have studied what genocide is understand that it is a process that unfolds over time. It does not happen in a day. Society is systematically and gradually prepared for genocide. This process has rather specific stages that can be described and, most importantly, recognized when they are being put into action.
Genocide refers to any actions committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Common risk factors include societal instability, increasing intolerance, systematic human rights violations, lack of state protection for the population, and the presence of motives and incentives in the information field that justify the use of force against specific population groups. The first stage of planned genocide is the dehumanization mentioned above.
The process and all its stages can be vividly observed in the example of the Holocaust. After the Nazis came to power, they began the first stage, propaganda that Jews were not human and that they posed a threat to society. Caricatures and articles demonizing Jews started to emerge. The myth of a global Jewish conspiracy was actively promoted. Gradually, people, the German population, became convinced that Jews were indeed a threat to them and their children. Similarly, anti-cultists are currently targeting various religious groups, branding future victims as cultists through informational terrorism. This tactic implants the notion in society that a cultist is equivalent to less than human. Now, I want to draw your attention to another fact. Propaganda, like terrorism, works in two directions simultaneously. One direction is the planned activity aimed at the potential target, and the other is the actions directed at everyone else, the general public, that is, at the witnesses of the crime being committed. Because to carry out such an operation, as the Nazis did at that time, and as the anti-cultists are doing now, the approval of the society is required. If not active support, then at least silent agreement and non-resistance. And for this, they first need to convince people that those the anti-cultists have chosen as their targets are dangerous to society and pose a potential threat. The public is first intimidated, their vigilance is lulled, and then, by deception, they are drawn to the anti-cultist side, making them accomplices to the crime. Back then, during the Holocaust, the German people became accomplices in the genocide of the Jewish people. Now, the accomplices to the crimes of anti-cultism are the people of Russia and those countries where anti-cultists are freely allowed to operate, where they still feel a sense of impunity and unchecked power. Just as the Nazis once marked Jews with a yellow star, anti-cultists now brand dissenters with the label cultist, which, in their interpretation, designates the target that can and should be destroyed. And take note, those who marked Jews with yellow stars may not have personally killed anyone, but in doing so, they incited violence among others. This is precisely what anti-cultists are doing now, opening a hunt on individuals and organizations they deem undesirable. Through covert manipulations, they incite all others to commit acts of violence while remaining on the sidelines themselves. This first stage of potential genocide became possible as soon as the anti-cult movement emerged, branding ordinary people simply for what they believe in. As soon as the labels cultist and totalitarian sect appeared, this stage has already been reached in modern society.
The second stage of a planned genocide is discrimination. This is when a branded individual or group is stripped of their human status as full membership of society, effectively ousting them from the social sphere. In Nazi Germany, Jews were initially prohibited from holding certain positions. They were banned from working as doctors, serving in the military or police, and teaching in higher education institutions.
There were too many Jewish doctors, too many Jewish lawyers, too many Jewish businessmen, too many Jewish journalists, too many Jewish bankers. The Nazis then could play upon this broader sense that the Jews had overstepped, the Jews had become inordinately influential.
Gradually, they were excluded from all professions. After the so-called Nuremberg race laws were enacted in 1935, Jews were further restricted in their freedom of movement. From then on, they could only live in designated areas, the ghettos. Today, people are already facing religious discrimination in countries where the anti-cultists have significant influence. For instance, leading European Union countries, Germany and France, have faced criticism for reviving practices that can be seen as religious purges. For example, Germany has implemented a practice known as the cult filter. This procedure requires individuals seeking employment or conducting business with government institutions and companies to confirm that they are not members of the Scientology Church and do not apply methods developed by Ron Hubbard. Suppose the answer is yes, and the person does affiliate with the Church of Scientology or has attended their lectures in the last 3 years. In that case, they will never be hired by a government agency or even a private company or association that has contracts with a government agency. Such measures apply to a wide range of professions, such as tennis coaches, gardeners, IT experts, instructors, trash bag suppliers, web designers, translators, etc. Legal practice in Germany already has dozens of court decisions that have deemed such cult filters illegal, including some issued by the highest federal courts. These rulings cite the violation of Scientology's rights to equality and non-discrimination, referring to Article 4 of the German Constitution, which guarantees freedom of religion. However, sanctions and penalties resulting from these court decisions seem to have no effect on some federal states, such as Bavaria, where the practice of cult filters continues to be applied today, despite judicial prohibitions. Thus, it can be asserted that the second stage of genocide, the stage of discrimination, is already being implemented in several countries right now, where groups of people labeled by anti-cultists face social isolation, job dismissals, prohibition to freely express their views, forceful persecution, and imprisonment.
It is clear that to prevent genocide, we must eradicate discrimination and prejudice in all forms and combat the spread of hatred and hostility based on ethnic, religious, and other distinguishing characteristics. However, the most tragic aspect of this stage of discrimination against an unjustly branded religious organization is the reaction of the witnesses to such actions. At this stage, it is no longer just silent agreement. In many cases, such events are met with approval. By this point, the preliminary psychological conditioning of the masses has convinced them that these cultists deserve their fate, viewing them almost like carriers of a contagion that could infect others. The fear of being associated with cults, the fear of public condemnation, shame, and the fear of being isolated from society, just like the victims, compels people to approve of the discrimination against innocent individuals. Therefore, with each new wave of escalating tension around the targeted organization and each new information attack, fewer people remain who can objectively assess the situation and contribute to preventing genocide. Similarly, once the German population was convinced that if the authorities treated Jews in a certain way, it meant they deserved it. What was the reaction of the German people to the new discriminatory laws? People openly supported them, and public support for Hitler significantly increased. Similar laws are now being implemented in Russia, modern Germany, France, and other countries regarding representatives of religious minorities, whom anti-cultists have labeled as followers of totalitarian sects. These people are subjected to persecution, raids, forcibly coerced to abandon their beliefs, deprived of their freedom, and placed in labor camps. Notice that this kind of discrimination against individuals labeled as cultists in your modern society is already perceived as something quite logical and even natural. Mostly, these people are left to fend for themselves, and only these religious movements targeted by anti-cultists take care of protecting their interests. However, Their efforts, all attempts to defend themselves against lawlessness and deliberate persecution, are not supported by other people, that is, society. The image of a cult prevails in people's minds over simple human qualities, conscience, and empathy for others' suffering. If you see something like this in your mind, know this: you are a potential victim of genocide. I remind you of the expression that accurately reflects the situation you are currently in. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Remember, first, you become a silent accomplice to the crime, and then you become its victim. As you know from history, Nazism did not stop at the stage of discrimination.
The third stage of planned genocide is persecution.
Wer selig geworden ist, der weiß, ohne Lösung der Judenfrage keine Erlösung der Menschheit.
In German society of those years, a growing sentiment was imposed that the measures taken were insufficient, that the threat from Jews still existed, and that the problem had not been resolved. Transitioning to this stage witnessed a surge in instances where Germans themselves began to assail Jews, dispensing vigilante justice. Pogroms erupted in ghettos, with Germans shattering the windows of establishments owned by Jews, spitting in their faces, and pelting them with stones. And mind you, Nazi propaganda didn't rely on facts and logic. Its aim was to evoke maximum emotion, to intimidate, to instill a perpetual sense of alarm, and to direct people toward an enemy upon whom they had every right to vent their fury, to release the pent-up tension.
The Nazi propaganda machine managed to convince the German people so effectively that Jews posed a threat to their personal well-being and the well-being of the country. As a whole, that Germans themselves began to appeal to the government to take action to rid them of the fear of the threat supposedly posed by Jews. Ultimately, the Nazis resorted to open persecution. Jews were shipped to Auschwitz and several other concentration camps. Well, as for what happened in those camps, you already know all too well. An entire people were systematically exterminated, innocent individuals, even children, for absolutely no reason. And just as unjustly, millions of dissenters are now under threat, because until the final stage, the climax of events, there remains just one step. And when that step will be taken, it's a matter of time. The entire process from the rise of Nazism, from the first acts of discrimination against Jews, to the first mass execution in a concentration camp, did not take much time. Today, the anti-cult movement, as a branch of global anti-cultism, has been around since 1993, roughly 30 years. And the peak of its manifestation is a matter of, perhaps, 5 years, maybe a year, or even a single day. And I'm not exaggerating. It all depends on the bridges they have already built, the behind-the-scenes political maneuvers they have conducted, and the tactical and strategic steps they have taken to close this trap. Right now, Anyone labeled by anti-cultists as a cultist is a potential target, just like the Jews who were once herded into gas chambers to suffocate or had their skin stripped off alive to preserve its elasticity for the gloves for some high-ranking official. Do you think such things can't happen in our time? You simply don't know what anti-cultists are already doing today. In China, what the anti-cultists in Russia and Europe aspire to is already happening: legislative bans on alternative religious movements and the transition to the third stage of persecution involving brutal physical reprisals against stigmatized victims. For instance, the Chinese authorities, with the involvement of anti-cult organizations, initiated a ruthless campaign of persecution against followers of Falun Dafa.
The Falun Dafa case. Terror in China. Falun Dafa, or Falun Gong, is a religious movement that emerged in the early 1990s, based on traditional Chinese Qigong health exercises, and quickly became very popular in China. The number of practitioners grew rapidly, and by 1997, it numbered tens of millions of people. The practice of Falun Gong was independent of party control, which is an unprecedented phenomenon in China. This led to tense relations between the Falun Dafa movement and the Chinese government. State media and the propaganda apparatus were mobilized to demonize Falun Gong, turn public opinion against it, and legitimize further persecution of its members.
Chinese Communist Party putting out just massive volumes of disinformation and propaganda denouncing Falun Gong, demonizing them.
Just as Dvorkin introduced the term totalitarian cult into active usage, the Chinese authorities of that time incorporated the terms cult and evil cult into their discriminatory rhetoric. In these regions, such terms carry very negative connotations and are associated with a specific negative historical context. This seemingly insignificant yet very effective tool allowed them to initiate one of the most brutal hate campaigns in their history. This is that very first stage, the same one the Nazis started with. For a long time, Falun Gong practitioners believed that the media writing defamatory articles about them simply did not understand the essence of their movement. However, it soon became apparent that this was an organized and deliberate campaign of harassment. The events that followed took a tragic turn. In 1999, the Chinese parliament passed the resolution on banning heretical cults. This decision meant that the Falun Dafa movement and any other unofficial religious movements were now prohibited by law. The law also stipulated that those who allegedly committed especially serious acts within cult organizations would be subject to imprisonment for 7 years to life, or even the death penalty. Although the law did not explicitly mention Falun Gong, it was clearly aimed at its practitioners. After the resolution was passed, a wave of repression began in the country. Falun Gong practitioners were arrested, imprisoned, and sent to labor camps where they were subjected to cruel treatment, beatings, torture, and as it was later revealed, forced organ harvesting for subsequent transplantation in Chinese clinics. This was conducted on a scale comparable to industrial production.
The doctors instructed him to take out the eyeballs.
And I said, I can't do it. I can't.
There are 41,500 transplants which have no other explained source.
I'm absolutely convinced that over a long period from 1999 onwards, organ harvesting from prisoners has been taking place, especially with Falun Gong.
And when someone comes into the country that needs a heart, a liver, a kidney, they find a match, they take the Falun Gong practitioner, extract their organs, of course killing them in the process.
Investigator.
So on your side, can you guarantee that there will be enough live organs from prisoners, for example, Falun Gong practitioners?
Receptionist.
Yes, we can. You can come over and we can talk about it in more detail.
Simultaneously, there was round-the-clock propaganda in the media, book burnings, and a purge within the party ranks to eliminate potential sympathizers or supporters of the Falun Gong movement. To eradicate Falun Gong, a special agency called Office 610 was established by order of the former leader of China, endowed with a wide range of powers. Agents of Office 610 were not bound by any laws in their use of methods to force Falun Gong practitioners to renounce their beliefs. This lack of restrictions allowed them to employ ruthless torture, which led to the death of many Falun Gong adherents. Chinese lawyers compare Office 610 to Hitler's Gestapo in terms of its functions. More than 3,500 deaths of Falun Gong practitioners have been documented and recognized as resulting from the repression. The officially registered number of those imprisoned for practicing Falun Gong exceeds 100,000. Unofficial estimates suggest that the actual figures could be much higher, considering the strict information control in China and the real danger faced by those attempting to investigate law enforcement actions.
Policewoman beat me. Yeah, this is my friend, Sun Shuxiang. She was persecuted, died in China.
Was taken in the middle of the night into a labor camp.
And they started dragging my dad away.
They arrest my grandma, torture her. They burn her back so much to the point she couldn't stand up straight anymore.
Around 10 people holding me, and then they had people like stick the very thick tube into my nose. I was vomiting, the food and blood, everything coming out of my mouth.
The global community's attention was drawn to the repression of Falun Dafa by the publication of a report by two independent human rights advocates. After conducting an investigation, they confirmed cases of mass-forced organ harvesting from Falun Gong practitioners in prisons, with the organs subsequently sold for transplantation. We have concluded that the government of China and its agencies in numerous parts of the country, in particular hospitals but also detention centers and people's courts, since 1999 have put to death a large but unknown number of Falun Gong prisoners of conscience. Their vital organs, including hearts, kidneys, livers, and corneas, were virtually simultaneously seized involuntarily for sale at high prices, sometimes to foreigners, who normally face long waits for voluntary donations of such organs in their home countries. To convey the full horror of what these people face, here is an excerpt from an interview with a police officer who witnessed the murders of Falun Dafa practitioners, published by the World Organization to investigate the persecution of Falun Gong. Witness.
We had been interrogating and severely torturing her for about a week. She already had countless wounds on her body. Also, we used electrical batons to beat her. She had already become delirious. However, we didn't know at this time. It was possibly a certain office in the Public Security Bureau of Liaoning Province anyway. It was a very secretive office that sent two people over. One of them was a military surgeon from the General Hospital of Shenyang Military Region of People's Liberation Army PLA, and the other one was a graduate of the 2nd Military Medical University. Specifically, one of them was relatively old, and the other one was young. They were doing something to her in an operating room of the mental hospital she was sent to. No anesthetics were used. They cut her chest with a knife without shaking their hands. If it were me, I would be shaking. Although I am an armed police, I held guns, I participated in live ammunition maneuvers, and I had seen many corpses, but when I saw these military surgeons, I was really impressed. Their hands didn't shake at all. They put on their surgical mask and started cutting immediately. At that time, we armed policemen were standing on guard, each with a pistol in hand. It sounded like something was being ripped apart. And then she continued. Since then, she always had her mouth wide open, with both her eyes wide open. Her heart was carved out first. Next were the kidneys. When her cardiac vessels were cut by the scissors, she started twitching. It was extremely horrible.
Can you imagine that all this is happening today in the 21st century? This is no longer just propaganda. These are concrete actions. Looking at this example, you can see the ultimate fate of a person branded as a cultist, stripped of their legal rights and freedoms, and deprived of their human status. These horrific things occur when people allow their rights and freedoms to be trampled upon, are intimidated by a series of psychological terror tactics, and remain silent, thinking it does not concern them. Do you really think that something or someone will protect you from the same fate if you allow democracy to perish?
It is noteworthy that during the period of repression against Falun Gong followers, representatives from RACIRS and FECRIS visited China on business trips. In other words, the anti-cultists actively participated in these events and openly expressed their support for the ruling party's actions. Some members of the French group CCMM associated with FECRIS were invited to a conference in Beijing in 2000, whose primary purpose was to criticize Falun Gong. At that time, human rights violations were already widely criticized by Western governments, the UN, and human rights organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. Nevertheless, FECRIS members cooperated with the Chinese authorities in denouncing Falun Gong without hesitation. Similarly, their Russian counterparts, represented by the ideological center of the anti-cultists and its leader Alexander Dvorkin, did the same. The cooperation between Russian anti-cultists and their Chinese counterparts began at the very onset of the discrimination against Falun Gong practitioners in China. In 2001, Zhang Baichun, a Chinese specialist in cults, visited Nizhny Novgorod. He participated in an anti-cult conference organized by Alexander Dvorkin and the Nizhny Novgorod diocese. One of the official purposes of his visit to Russia was to exchange experiences. However, what occurred during unofficial interactions and what instructions Dvorkin might have given to his Chinese colleague remains a mystery. In 2008, Alexander Dvorkin himself visited China on a working trip at the invitation of the Chinese Association for Research of Cults. During this trip, he appeared in Chinese media and spoke about the allegedly destructive and aggressive nature of the Falun Dafa movement.
Thus, Falun Gong is a rigid totalitarian sect, or destructive cult, whose members are used by its leader in his vendetta against the Chinese government, while he himself is used by American intelligence agencies for their foreign policy objectives.
Stated Alexander Dvorkin in his report. The destructive cult Falun Gong, the art of political manipulation, presented at the 16th International Christmas Educational Readings on January 30, 2008.
The paradox of this situation is that atheistic China allowed a Russian Orthodox anti-cultist to conduct propaganda on its territory. Why? This is at a time when in China, Orthodox Christianity is also basically treated as a cult. However, this did not prevent the Chinese authorities from openly inviting an Orthodox researcher of cults and letting him speak on local media. By what principle was he chosen for this mission? How did he earn such authority among the Chinese Communist Party?
Additionally, during the time when a new wave of accusations hit China for organ harvesting from Falun Gong practitioners, Orthodox archpriest and Russian anti-cultist Alexander Novopashin was invited to China for a conference on combating Falun Gong in the city of Harbin. As some researchers of the Falun Gong persecution in China assert, It was precisely the experience of Russian anti-cultists and their manuals that their Chinese accomplices relied on. This is why they were able to advance to the stage of physical reprisals more quickly. They didn't need to invent anything new. Adopting methods already tested on Russian citizens was enough. With the support of their ideological instigators, representatives of anti-cult organizations, including RAЦИRС and FECRIS, the Chinese authorities initiated persecution and imprisonment in labor camps of Falun Gong practitioners. There, they began vivisecting their chests, because they were supposedly no longer human.
There are plenty of such cases. If you think it's just some random lunatics committing these acts, you're mistaken. It's a streamlined production line involving government agencies, law enforcement, doctors, military medics, and of course, anti-cult organizations, the main suppliers of victims for the butchers. And this is China, which is now striving for geopolitical leadership on the world stage. A country where dissenters are herded into labor camps, treated like beasts of burden, and the healthier among them are harvested for use in black transplantology. Because according to their logic, the state is not obliged to support them at its own expense, so they must pay and pay with pieces of their bodies and their lives.
There are thousands of horrifying torture stories involving Falun Dafa practitioners that have been made public. Hundreds of thousands, possibly even millions of other cases remain hidden from the public eye. In China, censorship severely restricts access to and dissemination of information. It is particularly disturbing that these persecutions have not ceased to this day. Information about the ongoing persecutions, as of 2024, is regularly updated on the official Falun Gong website. Thus, based on the grim experience of religious repression in China and the presented facts about the activities of the anti-cult movement in Russia and Europe, the true aim of these anti-cult organizations becomes evident.
It is not by chance that the mass organ harvesting cases involving Falun Dafa practitioners became known to the public. The Chinese authorities intentionally allowed this information to leak so that these crimes would be documented and proven. This is their guillotine in the central square. It serves as a warning of what will happen to anyone they perceive as a threat to their power. This is an act of informational terrorism, bringing the entire country to its knees and forcing people into a state of subjugation. What is happening in China is an illustrative example that the methods and legacy of Nazism are alive, masked under the guise of combating religious dissent. Millions of ordinary people practicing their religion have fallen victim to an old, proven method that, at the instigation of anti-cultists, was used by the Nazis of the Third Reich during World War II. The Nazis justified the mass extermination of people by declaring that they were soulless animals unworthy of mercy. These methods are being put into practice today, in your time, by the anti-cultists of the Fourth Reich. What do you think they have planned for those already marked with a yellow star? They have already targeted around 60 million members of religious minorities and have begun a planned attack on several secular and political organizations. The next person to be labeled a cultist, and therefore not a person, could be anyone. And God help you if you find yourself in their victim's place. Everyone should understand that if global anti-cultism reached its ultimate goal and democracy was destroyed, one day you would wake up in a totalitarian world where, at any moment, your organs could be cut out alive and without anesthesia, without even asking you. I have said it before and will say it again. If the freedom of speech is taken away, then dumb and silent we may be led, like sheep to the slaughter. Now is the time to regain your sanity and examine what is happening right before your eyes. Anti-cultism is a phenomenon that should never have existed in our society. Anti-cultism today is a new form of Nazism. Let me put it this way. The concentration camps are already built. There are already camps where doctors remove organs without anesthesia, and these will become torture chambers and true concentration camps for millions of people tomorrow. For them, you are all on the verge of becoming slaves. You are all already in the midst of a Holocaust.
Thus, in accordance with the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, adopted on December 9, 1948, and ratified by 153 countries, the activities of members of anti-cult organizations and their accomplices are qualified as genocide. According to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, adopted on July 17, 1998, and ratified by 124 countries, the activities of members of anti-cult organizations and their accomplices are qualified as genocide and crimes against humanity. In accordance with the Convention on the Non-Applicability of Statutory Limitations to War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity, adopted by United Nations General Assembly Resolution 2391, on November 26, 1968, crimes against humanity are considered among the gravest crimes. Even if these acts do not constitute a violation of the internal laws of the country in which they were committed. Crimes against humanity have no statute of limitations, regardless of when they were committed and whether they were committed during wartime or peacetime.
Representatives of the terrorist network of anti-cult groups have not limited their targets to specific organizations and their members. They carried out a successful campaign to demonize an entire nation. The goal of this campaign was to prepare the public in their targeted country for aggression against this nation and to justify the extremely brutal and ruthless actions that were subsequently taken against its people. In fact, the anti-cultists orchestrated and legalized a genocide against an entire nation, the people of Ukraine.
The Ukraine case. Representatives and accomplices of the anti-cult movement made a series of outrageous statements about Ukrainians and Ukraine as a whole. These defamatory statements began to surface many years before the military conflict between Ukraine and Russia, as a preparatory stage of propaganda aimed at shaping public opinion, injecting and ingraining necessary narratives in people's minds. These statements have only intensified and taken on more radical forms now that the military conflict is in its active phase.
And in general, the situation with mass hysteria we observe in Ukraine resembles, in essence, what happens in cults.
One of the first to spread the idea that Ukraine is afflicted by Satanism, which is linked to Nazism, was Vladimir Rogatin, a corresponding member of the European Federation of Centers of Research and Information on Sectarianism, FECRIS. By a remarkable coincidence, this individual conducts his activities in Ukraine, while also being an active mouthpiece for Russian anti-cultists. In 2014, he began explaining the cause of the Euromaidan by attributing it to the harmful influence of new religious movements. He added that they were also behind what happened in Ukraine in 2004, namely, the Orange Revolution.
Discrimination has reached a qualitatively different level. We must acknowledge that it wasn't just Orthodox Christians and Uniates. There were also neo-pagans, Baptists, and various movements involved in the Maidan protests.
This completely aligned with the opinions of FECRIS Vice President Alexander Dvorkin, who had previously made similar statements.
We saw that the first Maidan was driven entirely by neo-Pentecostals, who were the main active forces. The second Maidan had a more complex religious component involving not only cults, but also the Uniate Church, which belongs to the Roman Catholic Church. However, Ukrainian Uniates are a special case, and in many ways, in general, they have, you could say, a cultist mindset as well. Well, there were also neo-pagans and Scientologists, too.
Similar sentiments were expressed by the RACIRS Vice President Alexander Novopashin.
So, what did the Ukrainians do? Or rather, their American curators and mentors? They began to direct these destructive cults and organizations. Remember the saying, if you can't beat them, lead them. Surprisingly, it was the American intelligence agencies who first started fighting the cults. But they failed. Then, they decided to try to control the cult leaders through bribery, intimidation, and so on. It worked. The same thing was done in Ukraine. Now, totalitarian sects, that is, destructive cults, while continuing their main destructive activities, have also started working for the Ukrainian regime. Neo-Pentecostals and neo-pagans took an active part in the Orange Revolutions, for example, on the Maidan. There, they gained considerable combat experience and can now be used to organize and sustain street riots in Russia.
In the same 2014 interview, Rogatin stated,
in Ukraine, there is a growing influence and presence of various satanic cults. According to various estimates, there are more than 100 satanic groups operating in our country, with a total of about 2,000 followers.
Subsequently, this rhetoric of Satanism supposedly engulfing Ukraine was picked up by high-ranking Russian government officials. They used similar narratives to justify the war as a necessity to de-Satanize Ukraine. Thus, the Assistant Secretary of the Security Council of the Russian Federation, Alexei Pavlov, stated,
I believe that, with the continuation of the special military operation, it becomes more and more urgent to carry out the desatanization of Ukraine, or, as the head of the Chechen Republic Ramzan Kadyrov aptly put it, its complete de-shaitanization.
Pavlov also mentioned the Church of Satan, which has allegedly spread throughout Ukraine, and claimed that
through network manipulations and psychotechnologies, the new regime has transformed Ukraine from a state into a totalitarian hypersect.
Ukraine, the whole country, is just one new cult.
This is an absolutely anti-Christian, absolutely anti-Orthodox political regime.
Additionally, back in 2014, on the website of the Missionary Department of the Novosibirsk Diocese chaired by the aforementioned Alexander Novopashin, an article was posted containing the following statements.
I just want to draw attention to one charming circumstance, namely the principle of Ukrainian-like state organization almost completely coincides with the principle of organizing a totalitarian sect or destructive cult. Meanwhile, for people who found themselves in a cult and once swallowed the cultist lie, this lie becomes a norm. Cultists not only lie to themselves and others, but they also stop perceiving any opinion different from the one imposed on them by the cult. Therefore, simply talking, persuading, or proving is a useless and thankless task. We must remember that the war in Ukraine isn't for territories. The war is for souls, and it will continue in one form or another until activities of the cult are stopped.
All this rhetoric is aimed at instilling in the minds of Russians the idea that the current military conflict is not just a war, but a holy war.
It is clear that loving Ukraine, the Lord is now punishing it. And I'll repeat once again, in order to understand what is happening, you need to understand why the Lord is punishing Ukraine. Why exactly Ukraine? Ukrainians now hate Russians because Russians are merely God's tool. It's like a belt with which a father punishes his child. It's a holy war. It's a war for what we believe in. So I wouldn't be surprised if calls are voiced in churches and mosques.
The rhetoric of a holy war is necessary for the state to justify its aggressive actions, in order to make people believe that their country and they themselves are fulfilling some sacred duty. The purpose of these narratives is to convince the public that a war leading to the destruction of the victim state, the deaths of countless people, and the destabilization of the entire democratic world is acceptable and even necessary. Most importantly, this global anti-cultism seeks to divert citizens' attention from how their own country, which initiated this war, is turning into a totalitarian state.
In Ukraine, The disease is so advanced that it's no longer possible to cure it with any persuasion, negotiations, or anything like that. Only surgery is possible there. So the only response to those Nazi speeches may be the Soncepek weapon. It should all be burned down, absolutely. Someone may tell me, oh, that's not a Christian way. It is quite Christian. It's just the ethics for those people. They position themselves as pagans, excuse me. So let them get what pagans should. Not the New Testament ethics is applicable there, but the Old Testament ethics, that of Elijah the prophet who himself cut the throats of 300 servants of Balaam. With these ones, we should do the same. Destroy them without any doubt. Just the Old Testament ethics, and they actually understand this language only. Be this vehicle sanctified. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Andre and I took holy water with us. I told all the brothers to lay out the machine guns, and we sanctified all the weapons. That is, we performed the rite of consecration. I drew a cross on my machine gun so that nobody would confuse that it's my cross, the priest's cross. It is my weapon, my sword.
Моя мама 18-го похоронила Берлера из этой войны.
Be these weapons, blessed and sanctified by sprinkled holy water.
The final chord, which indicates the ultimate goal of a number of such rhetoric, is the statement of another RACIRS leader, Archpriest Alexander Novopashin, who called Ukrainians cannibals.
For me, they are all cannibals. I called them so because I saw them like that. These inhumans spill human blood, the blood of children and women, our blood. They devour people's lives and feed on suffering. So who are they? Cannibals. And all those who committed terrorist attacks on our land, whom I listed earlier and whom I didn't name, are cannibals. It is useless to put cannibals in a cage. They'll still remain cannibals, even if you keep them there all their lives. Therefore, cannibals must be destroyed.
And these are the direct words of the leaders of RACIRS, FECRIS, and their accomplices, which manifest xenophobia, incite interethnic and interreligious hatred, and encourage the deprivation of life based on national and religious identity. Just as the Nazis, under Hitler's regime, declared the Jewish nation to be non-humans with the support of anti-cultists of that era, today's modern anti-cultists label Ukrainians as a cult, in fact, calling for the destruction of an entire nation, which tantamount to genocide. This is not a coincidence, but a deliberate action.
What we are seeing now is a war, primarily a spiritual war because the Antichrist is attacking the Holy Rus, the Orthodox Christianity. I'd like to teach you to load cartridges correctly, so that the cartridges hit the target, precisely destroy the enemy, and not fly aimlessly in the air. Thus, Holy Fathers teach us this way. When you take a bullet, you load it, and say the following words. Holy Mother of God, save us. Holy Father Nicholas, pray to God for us. Holy Mother of God, save us. Holy Father Nicholas, pray to God for us. Holy Mother of God, save us. Holy Father Nicholas, pray to God for us. Tsar Nicholas II, pray to God for us.
What does the Bible say? You shall not kill.
Do not load a grad rocket without prayer. For each of these, as you load it, say, Lord, have mercy, Lord, have mercy, and so on, and so on, and so on. And then, whoosh, boom.
Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said to your ancestors, 'You shall not kill, and whoever kills will be liable to judgment.'"
The Moscow Theological Seminary is fighting against NATO. Christ is risen.
Jesus said, "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another."
If a person dies when fulfilling this duty, then he undoubtedly commits an act equivalent to sacrifice. He sacrifices himself for others. Therefore, we believe that this sacrifice washes away all the sins that this person has committed.
After everything you have seen, tell me, how should the public perceive these people? Representatives of Russia's front religion and their faithful anti-cultist proponents? Who are they in essence, when even at the highest level, the leadership of this organization, calling for hatred, violence, and killing, violates God's commandments just as the Nazis once did? When using the name of God, as the Nazis did in their time, they break Christ's commandments, justify sadism, and call for the destruction of peaceful, innocent people. Can this organization be called religious, let alone Christian? Can we consider them followers of Christ? Answer this now. Who is their God? And whom do they truly serve? You have just seen a small part of what is actually happening, and this is only the beginning. In labeling certain groups and individuals as cults and cultists, the ideological center of terrorist anti-cult gangs did not limit itself to specific organizations, citizens of their own country, and Ukrainian citizens whom they believe need to be destroyed. The anti-cultist narratives have long extended beyond Ukraine. Today, they have already labeled the United States, all of Europe, the entire Western democratic world as cults and have declared them to be Satanists.
In order for the world to live in God's way and not in a satanic way, since they've already built a big satanic village with and without us, where there is one starry striped boss who teaches everyone to live in a satanic way. The Ukrainian political regime is certainly terroristic, extremist, and misanthropic. It is Nazi. The Z sign denotes a world where there is no place for Nazism and Satanism. Ukraine is rapidly rolling downhill, according to the plans prepared by Western and American experts. The special operation on denazification is carried out not just to destroy the Hydra in its lair. We defend the whole Russian world, we defend our civilization, we defend Russia from this evil, from the anti-system. Because if we don't do that, this infection might spread very widely, like a cancerous tumor. There are no societies that have developed 100% immunity against it. We can see that in the West.
The complete denial of a human, faith, and traditional values. The suppression of freedom takes on the characteristics of an inverse religion, outright Satanism.
And the war is not yet lost. It is very important that our country, which relies on its centuries-old spiritual and cultural tradition, having formed its own code of moral values, be capable in some sense also of leading this resistance. I will say an incredible word now, against the Antichrist. Today, I believe that I am acting in accordance with the will of the Almighty Creator. By defending myself against the Jew, I am fighting for the work of the Lord. Adolf Hitler, 1925. Mein Kampf.
As you can see, the public actions of anti-cult organizations' representatives lead to tragic events that occur sometime after their information injections. The rhetoric of anti-cult organizations' representatives, besides being filled with manipulative techniques, contains numerous hidden meanings. Anti-cultists do not simply make public statements. They serve as the mouthpiece for the enemy of the democratic world, who openly announces its plans through them. Additionally, their statements exert a covert influence on authorities. providing them with directives for action. In announcing their future plans, the hidden orchestrators of the global anti-cult network have already designated the entire democratic world as their next target. And notably, it is the anti-cultists, as heralds of this covert force, who dictate the rhetoric that is later adopted by Russia's top leadership, including President Putin, who embodies authority for millions of Russian citizens. To understand what the hidden enemy has already prepared for each of you, listen carefully to what this person, echoed by President Putin, has to say.
But if the question, when will all this end, is asked of me as a priest, then my answer is never. Once Ukrainian Nazism is dealt with, another aggressor country will emerge through which the USA will begin to threaten Russia. So the civilizational war is inevitable.
As you heard, he explicitly said that a war for civilization is unavoidable. Do you know why he said that? He said it because he knew that both America and Europe would soon be mired in civil war. He said it because he is already chilling champagne to celebrate his victory. And this was said by a seemingly inconspicuous person, but he is one of the leaders of anti-cult organizations that are part of global anti-cultism, and he is echoed by President Putin himself. Now, here, any intelligent person would ask, who truly holds power in Russia?
Я не хочу, чтобы я умирала. Хочу, чтобы быстрее это все закончилось.